Hi, this is Sarah. So this video is about cultural deprivation as an area within the sociology of education. So we're going to start off thinking about, well, what is cultural deprivation? And we need to remember that it's not material deprivation, because you will need to be able to differentiate between those two things. And if you have a question on one of them, you don't want to accidentally talk about the other, which is something that we do see students unfortunately doing in the exams. So cultural deprivation is supposedly people from working class backgrounds having inferior norms and values. Now you can tell by the way I'm speaking there that that is a kind of new right sort of functionalist view. So we can problematize that and we can evaluate that a lot. But first of all, we need to understand what this position is. So cultural deprivation as having inferior norms and values, which puts you at a disadvantage in your life. And the very notion that working class subcultures and working class culture itself is deficient and is to blame for children's educational failures. So this would be used as a way of explaining why we see a difference in the achievement and attainment for primary school pupils, for GCSE grades, for A-level grades. Why do we see that working class children are performing differently? So we have 5 core ways that cultural deprivation manifests within education. The first is that there have been studies that prove or that show that there is a lack of parental interest in a child's education if they grow up in a working class family. So Douglas is one sociologist we can cite who looked into this and found from their studies that this was the case. So there's a lack of parental interest in working class families, and this may be from a young age, things like learning to read and write. Often you'll see families teaching their children to do that before they start school. And if there's a lack of interest, not only that kind of lack of teaching your child at an early age, but also maybe having books around in the house, reading with your child, reading aloud. We've all seen the statistics, or you probably have seen the statistics about how children are more likely to be successful if they read aloud and if they are read to as a child. So this lack of parental interest really juxtaposes with some of the other studies we look at about how middle class families have a big interest. Okay, second, we have the cultural deprivation of families who are less able to help with homework. And what this means is that families who themselves weren't educated to a high level, who do manual jobs where they don't need to use high levels of literacy, maybe they have very low levels of literacy themselves, and also possibly they have kind of trauma related to their own education experiences where they felt very inferior, and where they didn't progress and they didn't feel confident in even really navigating children's books. And then as that goes on through a child's school life, they're coming home with mathematical problems, they're coming home with literature to read and high level sort of critical thinking to do. So these parents who haven't had that educational background themselves won't necessarily be able or be in a position to help their own children. So even if they are pro-education, they may not be able to do that sort of level of teaching or support from home. The third element of cultural deprivation, so far we've had lack of parental interest, we've had the lack of ability to help children with their homework. We then have Bernstein's speech codes. And this idea that working class families have restricted speech codes. So Bernstein, as you possibly know, talks about the elaborate code and the restricted speech code. And the restricted speech code we would probably all recognise if we hear it. It can be quite colloquial, quite localised. There can be a lot of slang, but usually there's also a kind of a lack of the use of literacy. Some of us will be able to switch between restricted speech codes and elaborate speech codes, particularly if you're from a socially mobile background where you maybe came from a working class background but you then went to university. So you may be able to switch between the two. But for a lot of children, having these restricted speech codes, and that's what they hear at home, then coming into school and being faced with teachers using elaborate code, books using elaborate code, exam questions using elaborate code, that can be a real barrier. So that's another example of cultural deprivation. Another important part, so this is our fourth example of cultural deprivation. So you need to be proficient in having all five of these, you know, really ready to retrieve from your memory at any point in the exam. Immediate gratification. Now, Sugarman did a study on this, and using Sugarman's study is an excellent example to bring in for application and to then analyse in your exam essays. The idea is that working class people are not so good at, I mean, it sounds like a terrible stereotype. This is what the studies are saying, it's not what I'm saying. But allegedly, people from working class backgrounds are not so good at delayed gratification. They're not so good at investing their time in something where the benefits will come much later on. So they are more likely to want things that give you immediate gratification. Now, that might be fun. That might be hanging around with your mates. That might be bunking off school for a day because you're going to get a buzz from doing that. It might be avoiding things like 3 years at university in order to then get benefits from that later on. It might be sitting and studying on a weeknight rather than seeing your friends because you have an exam in maybe 6 weeks' time. So any of those longer term investments would be seen as delayed gratification. So immediate gratification is seen as something that the working class families will go towards more than the delayed version. And what this means is that becomes a form of cultural deprivation because it's a norm and a value that is held by working class families that can therefore disadvantage them in their education and therefore in their educational achievement. So the fifth type of cultural deprivation, so far we've had lack of parental interest, less able to help with homework, restricted speech codes, immediate gratification. And the fifth is the idea of there being an underclass in society. So this has been explored by the New Right. This is kind of New Right rhetoric that we will hear in certain newspapers, and certain kind of politicians and people on the news will talk about this. And you can cite Melanie Phillips and also Charles Murray as well. And what they're saying about this underclass is that it's not that we've got your kind of middle class and working class, but they're saying that there's this kind of underbelly of the population who actually don't work, so we can't call them working class. And what they're referring to is the kind of people who may be maybe second or third generation unemployed, where it's become a normal part of the family's culture not to work. It's tied in with a lot of stereotypes about people who are not working because they can gain money from benefits, people who are not working because they know they'll have a roof over their head anyway. This is all written and spoken about by the New Right in a very negative way towards these people. So the idea of this underclass is that you would think, if you were that child, you'd be thinking, well, why would I study at school? Why do I need qualifications? What is all this about? My family get paid, everything paid for, they get looked after, we have a welfare state, they're going to look after me. Why do I need to go to university or get my GCSEs? Now, this is definitely a perspective from the New Right. It's not necessarily true. It really overlooks some of the unfairness, the inequalities, the barriers and the deprivations that are in children's upbringings. But from a New Right perspective, if we bring this into an exam, it enriches the range of perspectives that we're bringing in. And that can be very helpful because when you start comparing those and sort of looking at the similarities and differences of views on the same thing, which is educational achievement and cultural deprivation, then you start to develop those AO3 skills where you're showing your analysis and your evaluation. And when you're evaluating cultural deprivation, bringing in the New Right is really helpful because you're bringing in a different perspective again. And then you can carry on evaluating that by saying, well, the New Right say this, however, Marxists would argue, you know, and if you look at, you're talking about things like cultural capital, and you're talking about things like parentocracy and postcode divisions with education and all these other things that get in the way, and poverty and material poverty, because when you look at cultural and material deprivation, you've got to recognize that they are two different things within the sociology of education, but material deprivation and cultural deprivation inevitably happen together. So we will see families who are in poor you know, poverty line conditions, and then these subcultures of working class, or what the new right would call underclass culture, will also be at play. So these things are intersecting, yet if you are asked to speak about one of them, you need to be able to cite the right example. So those 5 that we've talked about in this video are your cultural deprivation, and then you need to be able to list examples of material deprivation as well, and that'll be covered in a video on material deprivation. So to recap, and please make sure you have revision cards on this, make sure you have this written down, make sure you recall and unpack this memory often enough that your memory retrieval is nice and fluid, and it's going to come at the time when you most need it, not just to impress your teachers and your peers in class, but also when you're in the exam, and you know, you really need to unpack this quickly. It needs to be on the tip of your tongue. So we are looking at lack of parental interest, less ability to help with homework, restricted speech codes, thinking about Bernstein's theories, immediate gratification, looking at Sugarman, the underclass, looking at Melanie Phillips. And so you've got these 5 different arguments. Remember, you can juxtapose those with cultural privilege. So where do we see examples of cultural privilege, where there's a real pro-school, pro-education subculture? And we can use people like Louise Archer and Becky Francis looking at Chinese families, where there definitely isn't that cultural deprivation. There is this absolute idea of a family project. So reading at home, helping with homework, these all become natural parts of family life. And you can juxtapose that, you know, we can, and also you can say, oh, but also we've got middle class children will have this, this and this. You know, middle class children will have parents who possibly, it's not just the cultural privilege in terms of helping them with their homework, but those middle class parents might be a CEO of a large company who've got loads of friends who are CEOs of other companies, and therefore it's really easy to organise work experience in every half term for that child to go and you know, and get to mix, and then social capital starts to come into it, and all of these skills and this social capital and this cultural capital are all being built through this child's life, when the working class child, maybe in the same town, has less opportunities and different values coming from the family home. And when you're analysing the idea of cultural deprivation, the causation that you need to be looking at is really that this is the starting point in the child's life, and these norms and values are going to affect their entire approach to education, but also how they will be perceived by their teachers. So we can link this in with teacher labelling and stereotyping, because these children will be possibly seen as less able and seen as less valuable in the classroom, and that may not actually be the case. It may be because of that restricted code, it may be because they're not able to get help with their homework at home, it may even be because they're actively discouraged from doing their homework because that's seen as not a desirable quality within the subculture of their own home. So the Marxist view of cultural deprivation is a really useful view to bring in, because it directly compares and contrasts with this new right view that inferior norms and values are somehow broken. And what Marxists will say is that we are blaming the working classes on having this apparently inferior subculture, but actually Marxists see the working classes as victims of a very unfair system. And they see the education system as valuing certain things and sort of putting middle class culture, positioning it above and better than working class culture. So we see working class families being kind of othered within education, and we see them being positioned as less worthy and their values as being less important. And that could be everything from what they do in their spare time, what their values are, what their parents do for jobs, and that kind of thing. So an important analysis of the Marxist view of cultural deprivation is that the new right and functionalists are treating working class culture as inferior. They're treating it as less than, when really Marxists will say these are just different cultures. So a Marxist will say, well, in the school there should be an appreciation of all cultures and everyone should be given the same opportunities, but we should realise that there are differences that children are coming in with to school. And we really want to focus at some point in the essay on white working class culture, because we know that white working class boys are one of the most underachieving groups. And that therefore means we've got evidence that there is something going wrong within the education system and that the equality definitely isn't there, regardless of all of the new right arguments about social mobility being available. It's clearly not happening for enough people, and the statistics, the results, the schools' results are telling us that. We can also look at the postmodernist view and outlook on cultural deprivation, because what postmodernists will do is they will say there's no longer a distinct working class. We've moved past these kind of proud working class identities with these sort of manual labour jobs that actually don't exist anymore, because so much of the manual labour has been moved out of the UK and we don't really see people going into those jobs anymore. So you'll see other studies in different areas about the loss of working class identity, and that being used as an explanation for some kind of anti-school subcultures. If you look at Paul Willis and Learning to Labour, that's used, as a real reason or an explanation, and the way things have shifted. So postmodernists are going to kind of say, well, we're not all restricted by class anymore. There's not such a thing as working class. Really, we need to look at everybody and we need to look at individual stories, but we can't sort of group everyone into these kind of meta narratives about which class group they're from. So you've got, for your analysis and for your evaluation, when you're juxtaposing these different views and kind of piecing them together to show a really balanced essay, you've got your functionalist and new right ideas about norms and values being inferior with working classes, and therefore that's what their explanation of cultural deprivation is. You've got Marxists saying, well, let's not blame these people are the victims, and you've got postmodernists saying, well, really, can we actually even talk about these people? We should be looking more at individuals because we can't bulk people into class groups anymore. And there you have it. So just to recap the 5 types of cultural deprivation, and we're going to finish on that. They are lack of parental interest in child's education, less ability to help with homework at home, restricted speech codes, immediate gratification, and the notion of the underclass from the new right. So finally, if you want to delve a bit deeper into ideas of cultural deprivation and how that class status can act as a barrier to educational achievement, and all of the arguments that surround that, and all the evaluative arguments about social mobility, and how, a lot of people, the new right would argue it's not about the child coming in with these attitudes that's going to limit them forever. Actually, it's about this child coming in and realising they have opportunities, and every child can go to Oxford or Cambridge, and every child they just have to work hard. That's the new right rhetoric. The more we explore it, the more we see that there are a huge number of barriers. But if you're interested in reading more about this, then I would recommend this book, Miseducation by Diane Ray, or any academic papers. You don't have to buy the book. You might look on Google Scholar or somewhere, and you may find academic papers by Diane Ray. So Diane Ray, and this book, Miseducation, is a really nice read, particularly for an A-level student, because it has lots of dialogue of, students being interviewed about kind of their experiences of a very classed education system. And she also shares her own upbringing as well, and coming from a council estate, and how she was treated in class. And in some other videos I will be doing some readings from this book as well, so if you don't want to go and read it yourself, you will have the opportunity to sit back and listen to it.